What did the Russian world bring to countries and peoples, including those who waited for it and supported it? Important. This video is completely neutral and is for educational purposes only. Hello, dear viewers. In this video review, we will talk about the results of the so-called Russian world for countries and peoples. By the Russian world, we mean pro-Russian movements in countries and peoples, the purpose of which was to bring them closer to the Russian Federation. As well as movements in Russia itself, aimed at bringing neighboring countries closer and even joining the Union with the Russian Federation or joining the Russian Federation. An integral part of this Russian world was the concept of Slavic peoples, Russian-speaking population, Russian Spring, original Russian territories, and so on. In turn, Russia used these concepts not only to try to get closer to these countries and peoples, but also as a pretext for invading these countries and even joining them militarily to the Russian Federation. Or at least, turning them into states controlled by Moscow. In fact, in this way, Russia wanted to restore its empire. The area of distribution was the Slavic or Russian-speaking peoples, as well as the concept of original Russian territories. The spread of Russian fascism, or simply Rashism, on the territory of the Russian Federation deserves special attention. It is this ideology that will be the basis of Russian nationalism. It is this ideology that will inspire the Russian masses to expand and conquer neighboring countries. In turn, some residents of many countries, in the vast expanses of the former USSR, also wanted the restoration of the Russian Empire. As a rule, this was the Russian-speaking part of the population of these countries. How Russia used them for its own purposes, and what it brought them in the end, we will consider in this video. We will look at the results of attempts to restore the Russian Empire. We will look at the results of Russian expansion. We will show what this so-called Russian world brought to these countries and peoples. And now, everything in order. As a result of the democratization of the Russian Federation after the collapse of the USSR, and its cooperation with the developed democratic world, Russia was able to restore its economy and began to increase the income of its citizens. All this coincided with the growth of energy prices in the world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, sanctions and isolation were lifted from the Russian Federation. Russia began to sell resources to developed countries and began to receive super profits for this. Thus, Russia was able to restore the army, accumulate economic and financial reserves. But such large incomes also had negative consequences, both for Russia itself and for the world as a whole. And especially for its neighbors, who were previously part of the Soviet Empire. Because, having super profits, Russia felt invulnerable. It tried to restore the USSR, tried to restore the Russian Empire. To implement this idea, it unleashed a number of wars and conflicts. It began invasions, as a rule, into neighboring countries. Among them are Moldova, Azerbaijan with Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine. In these countries, with the participation of the Russian army, frozen military conflicts appeared. Russia invaded Syria, where it began to help its dictator, against whom a popular revolution began in the country. Also, the Russian Federation managed to unleash wars on the territory of the Russian Federation itself. For example, with the Chechen Republic of Ikaria. Moreover, later, an attempt to restore the USSR led to the beginning of a full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war. Thus, the frozen hybrid local Russian-Ukrainian war in 2022 escalated into a full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war. Therefore, now let's see what this so-called Russian world, for which the Russian population and the pro-Russian population in neighboring countries so strongly advocated, brought to neighboring countries. Also, let's see what it brought to Russia itself. These are the cities of Syria. Russia brought there only war and destruction. Russia repeatedly bombed the cities of this country with carpet bombing. Russian aircraft destroyed entire cities. Civilian populations were hit. Russia brought only losses and destruction to Syria. If it weren't for Russia and Iran helping it, the Syrian population would have changed its government, overthrown the dictatorship. And the country would have continued to develop peacefully and prosper. But Russia and Iran's military aid to the Syrian dictator turned the country into ruins. Let's take Georgia. The country lived peacefully until Russia got involved with its army. What happened as a result? Georgian wars and more losses and destruction. Russia gave Georgia nothing but war. It bombed Georgia, and its troops tried to capture the capital and enslave the Georgian people. It's the same in Karabakh, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Until Russia got involved with its army, there was peace and prosperity. As soon as Russia got involved, war broke out. Countries were destroyed. Cities and towns were destroyed. And only the war in Ukraine and Russia's preparation for a full-scale invasion saved Azerbaijan from Russia's invasion. Saved Azerbaijan and Armenia from new large-scale losses and destruction. Russia is deeply bogged down in Ukraine. Now look at Ukraine. What did the Russian Spring give to Ukraine, and what will the Russian world give to Ukraine? In Ukraine, it was the southeastern population that supported Russia the most. In the center and west of Ukraine, support from the population for Russia was minimal. And look what the Russian world brought to this pro-Russian population. This is war and destruction again. I wonder if the residents of Donbas knew that their so-called federalization would lead to such a war, would they have started it in 2014? I wonder if the pro-Russian population of southeastern Ukraine knew what their support for Russia would lead to, would they have supported Russia? If they knew that Russia would use them as cannon fodder, would they have followed Russia? Donbas was heavily destroyed in the battles of 2014 and 2015. But this was only the beginning. A full-scale war will change all the ideas of the pro-Russian population in Ukraine and the world. This is Kharkiv. Russia mercilessly bombs it with missiles and bombs. The city is located near the Russian-Ukrainian border. Previously, Russian artillery also reached it. But earlier this city was the center where pro-Russian forces in Ukraine gathered. They gathered in Kharkiv, wanted federalization, starting in the 1990s. Right after the collapse of the USSR. And in 2014, just before the Russian invasion, there was another congress of pro-Russian forces there. They created the so-called Ukrainian Front, the symbol of which was the St. George ribbon. The same one that would later become the symbol of the Russian army that invaded Ukraine. The symbol of the Russian occupation forces. And if from 2014 to 2022 Kharkiv managed to avoid war and destruction, there were no bombings there. Then starting in 2022, Russia began to constantly bomb Kharkiv. Before the war, it was the second most populous city in Ukraine. At least 1.5 million people lived there. And what did the residents of Kharkiv get from Russia? Only war, losses, and destruction. A large number of residents were forced to leave the city. Because Russia began to constantly bomb it. Russia brought the so-called Russian world to Kharkiv. And this is Kherson, where a significant part of the population also previously supported Russia. This was clearly visible in the elections of the President and the Supreme Council of Ukraine. In these regions, the pro-Russian Party of Regions, which, by the way, brought Yanukovych to the presidency, was constantly winning. Although after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the population support for Russia in this region fell sharply. Residents saw that Russia had brought them only wars and destruction. At the time of Russia's invasion in 2022, almost the entire population of the southern regions of Ukraine supported Ukraine. Support for Russia there was minimal. This was clearly demonstrated by the popular uprisings against the Russian occupation. When Russia occupied Kherson in 2022, the city rebelled against the occupier. People did not let Russian equipment pass, turned their troops around and lay down under the wheels of trucks and the treads of Russian tanks. The whole world saw that the south of Ukraine was categorically against the Russian occupation. The whole world saw that the population was for Ukraine and against Russia. The city of Kherson was large and people there managed to come out to rally and rebel against the occupier. These were broad masses of the population, hundreds of thousands of residents. And in other cities, people also came out to rally against the Russian occupation, but Russian troops managed to suppress the uprisings. Because other cities and towns were much smaller than Kherson. And there Russia managed to easily suppress anti-Russian uprisings. But the main thing is that everyone in the world saw that the south of Ukraine is against Russia and its occupation. And Russia itself saw it. So, after the deoccupation of Kherson, Russia began to mercilessly bomb it. Russian bombs, missiles, artillery began to destroy this once flourishing city. The Russian world brought it only losses and destruction. And the whole world saw it. Most of the residents left the city, left their homes. Because Russia began to constantly launch missile bomb and artillery strikes on the city. And a frequent element of Russian attacks was carpet bombing from MLRS, using cluster munitions. This was the case in many cities, because this is one of the most common munitions of the Russian army, Russian rocket artillery, and this is the city of Nikolaev. Russia also bombed it intensively. Most of the population of Kherson and Nikolaev were forced to leave their homes due to constant bombing by the Russian army. Zaporizhia region, Dnipropetrovsk. Both in Dnipro and in Zaporizhia, many people were pro-Russian. And look, it is precisely those regions that supported Russia the most that suffered the most from the war. Russia brought only war and destruction to the people who supported it the most in Ukraine. This is the Russian world. This is war. And only war. Apparently, Russia does not know how to do it any other way. And this war gave Ukrainians an understanding of what the Russian world and support for Russia are. People in the southeast of Ukraine felt for themselves what the Russian world is and what war is. But earlier, before Russia interfered in Ukraine, they lived in peace and freedom. These regions prospered, like many others in Ukraine. The standard of living in Ukraine grew, the well-being of the population also increased. The country and regions developed in peace. Ukraine was becoming a democratic and free country. What did Russia bring to these regions and to Ukraine as a whole? What did it give besides war, losses, and destruction? Ukraine, Syria, Azerbaijan with Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, have become a clear example of the fact that where Russia gets involved, there will definitely be only war and losses. Russia brings only war and destruction to countries. And Russia is not interested in the pro-Russian population in other countries. Russia only needs it as a pretext for invasion. Look at the same Donbas. These are the ruins of the once existing city of Bakhmut. And this is what remains of the once flourishing city of Avdiivka. Until the Russian world came there and began to liberate the residents from who knows what. Well, it liberated them. The city was practically wiped off the face of the earth. And so it is with many cities in Ukraine. And so it is in other countries where the Russian army got involved. Is this the kind of life the residents of these countries wanted when they supported Russia? Is this the kind of life the residents of Donbas wanted when they advocated the so-called referendum and federalization? And also when they asked Russia for help? So Russia helped them. Now these once flourishing cities lie in ruins. And take Donbas. The residents there don't even have water. It is supplied for a couple of hours every 2 to 3 days. Moreover, the pressure is weak, and the water is brown. It is not suitable for drinking. Is this the life the residents of Donbas wanted? Is this the life the residents who support Russia wanted? And in Ukraine, these were prosperous cities and regions. People lived in peace and happiness under Ukraine. And what did Russia give them besides war and destruction? It was the war unleashed by Russia that gave all Ukrainians an understanding of what Russia and the Russian world are. In fact, having started a war with Ukraine, Russia lost it. This happened back in 2014, during Russia's first invasion of Ukraine. Then many began to say that Russia received Crimea, but lost all of Ukraine. And even after this local war in Donbas, there were still many residents in Ukraine who supported Russia. They were pro-Russian. But the war of 2022 changed everything dramatically. Everyone understood that in order to live in peace, they need to stay away from Russia, away from the Russian world. Otherwise, one day this Russian world will come to them with war. And the war will be exactly where the population supports Russia the most. This changed everything in Ukraine. The country has completely turned towards joining the EU and NATO. And before the war of 2014, the idea of joining NATO was supported by approximately 5 to 6% of the population of Ukraine. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the idea of joining NATO was supported by more than 50% of the population. How do you think the mood in Ukraine has changed since the start of the full-scale Russian invasion? And they have changed so much that the majority of Ukrainians have begun to switch from Russian to Ukrainian. And even in those cities and regions where they previously communicated in Russian. Russia itself has pushed Ukraine away from itself into the arms of NATO and the EU. The war has shown who is really a friend for Ukraine and who is an adversary and even an enemy. It is noteworthy that this happened not only in Ukraine, but in all the countries where Russia intervened with its army. Russia's attempt to restore the USSR by military means ended in failure. And Russia could not offer anything else to its neighboring countries except war. After all, the problem is not that Russia's neighbors began to massively distance themselves from Russia and join the EU and NATO. The problem is why these countries began to leave Russia. And it lies in the fact that Russia could not give these countries anything good. Because the countries wanted freedom, independence, the creation of a state governed by the rule of law, the development of democracy, and so on. And what could Russia, which was mired in corruption, give? An authoritarian dictatorship was formed on the territory of Russia, where the population has no rights or freedoms. Did the residents of neighboring countries want to live like that? Of course not. And Russia could not offer them anything else. So they turned around en masse and left Russia. They went to where there is the rule of law, where there is developed democracy and freedom for the population. The countries went to the European Union. Russia lost ideologically. No one in free and independent countries wanted to return to the conditions of dictatorship like the USSR. And Russia only wanted to recreate this Soviet Union, including threatening countries with war if they refused. For which, for example, frozen conflicts were created along the perimeter of the former USSR. Therefore, many countries fled from Moscow to the EU and NATO to protect themselves from a possible Russian invasion. They were looking for security for themselves. And only NATO and the EU could provide it. Or the presence of their own nuclear weapons. If they did not have them, then the countries simply had no alternative to NATO and the EU. So Russia itself created such conditions that neighboring countries began to flee from it. No one wanted to go back to the concentration camp of nations called the USSR or something like that. And the wars unleashed by Russia became the apogee of the desire of neighboring countries to distance themselves from Russia as far as possible. Russia could not create such conditions within its own country that neighboring countries would want the same. Russia could not make neighboring countries themselves reach out to it. As they reach out to the EU and NATO. Russia could not make neighboring countries themselves want to unite with it. But Russia tried to restore the USSR by force. And it succeeded until it started a war with Ukraine. The Russian-Ukrainian war changed everything. Sweden and Finland immediately went to NATO. All other countries started talking about the same. There was no alternative to the EU anymore. Especially in conditions when Russia had slid into a harsh totalitarian dictatorship. This means that Russia will face more future wars and conflicts. All those frozen wars that were created with its participation will sooner or later resume. Azerbaijan and Syria have shown that in order to achieve peace, it is necessary to restore their territorial integrity by military means and expel Russia from their territories. They succeeded and the countries became free. Russia can do nothing, since it is bogged down in the Russian-Ukrainian war. This war became the opportunity in which countries could become free and free themselves from Moscow. So Georgia and Moldova will be next in line. Perhaps Chechnya and Dagestan. By the way, between these republics, Russia repeated the experience with Armenia and Azerbaijan. It also took part of Dagestan's territories and transferred them to Chechnya. And no one asked Dagestan's opinion. In general, everything is as was previously done with Nagorno-Karabakh, when it was transferred from Azerbaijan to Armenia. Russia knows that Dagestan and Chechnya can rebel and try to secede from the Russian Federation. Therefore, Russia has already prepared the conditions to prevent this. Of course, if Dagestan wants to leave, then part of its territory will be occupied by Chechnya. And then most likely Russia will have to side with Chechnya and help militarily. If this happens, Dagestan and Chechnya will get a completely 100% similar frozen conflict, which was between Azerbaijan and Armenia. It was possible to resolve it only by military means. And only after the expulsion of the Russian army from there. It was not easy to do. But the Russian-Ukrainian war gave such a chance. While Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, many countries got the opportunity to become free from Moscow. Also, Dagestan and Chechnya can initially prevent the creation of such a military conflict between them. Chechnya can return these territories transferred by Russia back to Dagestan and avoid war. After all, it has a striking example of Karabakh, over which the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia lasted 30 years. In this case, Chechnya and Dagestan may not have territorial disputes and be free and independent from Moscow. And in the same way, if as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war the collapse of Russia begins or a severe political and economic crisis begins, this will give opportunities not only to neighboring countries to free themselves from Moscow, but also to some republics within the Russian Federation to become free. For example, Dagestan and Chechnya. What will happen if during the internal crisis in Russia, some of its republics want to separate and become independent, declare their withdrawal from the Russian Federation? After all, Chechnya already tried to do this before the collapse of the USSR and immediately after its collapse. And what will happen if at the same time these will be republics neighboring Russia, such as Georgia and Moldova, and Ukraine too? What do you think? Write your opinion in the comments. This concludes our video. Special thanks from the author to everyone who helps the channel. Your help is very important. Like, comment and subscribe to the channel, where many more interesting videos await you. Thanks for watching.